QSO Today, episode 506, Stuart Watchman, ZL2TW. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. We now also receive affiliate credit for sales that you make by clicking on first the affiliate link before you go shopping on those sites. Since we are commercial ad-free, we only stay afloat from your generous donations to QSO Today. I want to thank everyone whose regular monthly sponsorship renewed this week. See the updated report on the show notes page. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Just a reminder that the response to my amateur radio events calendar has been great. You can get to it from a banner link on the show notes page. This calendar is updated by you, and I hope that it will be the most comprehensive amateur radio events calendar on the internet. Please use it and update it with your ham radio events. If you are new to the QSO Today podcast, please be sure to look at the QSOtoday.com website, where we have over 500 interviews with amateur radio operators. From there, you can click on links that take you to the QSO Today Academy. Our catalog contains over 500 videos on every ham radio subject, completely searchable. Stuart Watchman, ZL2TW, hails from New Zealand, where he began his early career working for the New Zealand Post Office on telephone exchange equipment, then made the transition to medical school, becoming a physician. Ham radio was an early passion, leading Stuart to work in technical positions to pay for medical school, and later to leadership positions with the New Zealand Association of Radio Transmitters, NZART, New Zealand's League. ZL2TW shares his amateur radio experience in this QSO Today. ZL2TW, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Stuart?
Yeah, 4Z1UG. This is ZL2TW, 5 and 9, Eric.
Thanks, Stuart, for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Yeah, sure. I sort of had a bit of a fits and starts at this. Originally, I got interested in electricity way back as a preschooler. I used to grab old extension cords and tie them up around the house and loop them around rooms and things. And my mother used to think that I had some big future in this. I remember my father rewiring our house and replacing all the light switches with the new models. And we had these lying around in some light sockets. And I was about 5, I think, and I thought I'd wire them all up. And my father very bravely plugged this into a 3-pin outlet. And boom, the fuse went. So I learned how to mend a fuse when I was quite young. And then he showed me how to wire it up, and I sort of soon learned how to read circuits and so on. And he had made up an old handbook on the bookshelf. My father was nearly became a ham way back in the 40s, but he never really went with it. And I remember looking at the pictures almost before I could read and thinking this was pretty cool. But my father was a telephone technician with the New Zealand Post Office. New Zealand was like a lot of the sort of Commonwealth countries in Great Britain, where the post office would handle postal and telecommunications. So that was his job, and he'd bring bits and pieces home for me to have a play with. And some of them were things like Western Electric relays, from a bit like you use in the Western Electric panel system in the US, but we had a thing called the rotary system, switching system here, and he'd bring these home and wire spring relays from crossbar switches, and I'd wire these up and have a play with them and so on. And my grandmother would buy me books. Those little ladybird books you might have heard of from the UK. Yeah, and just started playing with that kind of stuff. And I always wanted to know how things worked. And I'll give you an example. I got a bit obsessed just down the road from us on the motorway going into Wellington, the capital. I knew that power lines had three-phase lines, and there was one that had just two, and I was intrigued by that and read a bit about it. And guess what? Years later, I did a talk to a radio club on high-voltage DC, which interconnects in North and South New Zealand.
I don't think anybody knows that there are high-voltage DC lines anywhere in the world.
There's a few around, and they are important carriers of bulk electricity. So that was one example. My brother there was quite a gap. I'm the youngest of three, and my oldest brother was about 9 years older than me, and he got a stereo for his new car, so I'd wire up the loudspeakers. And anyway, I read every book that the school library and then the town library had, and then started getting into kit sets and crystal sets. My first kit set was, I don't know if you remember the Texas Instruments SN76001. It was an audio amplifier, about 1 watt. It was the predecessor, it was kind of their answer to, probably before the LM380. So I built one of those up and attached it to the crystal set, and then started playing with transistor devices like, multi-vibrators, flip-flops, making LEDs flash or lamps. And that was all this germanium stuff, the AC128s and things, or PNP germanium transistors that were more British, and then the BC107s. I got into NPN and had to work out to put the plus and minus up the other way. Made some burglar alarms and so on.
So you're doing all this in elementary school or pre-high school?
Yeah. And then we have a sort of a middle school here called intermediate, which is year 7 and 8. And that's where it kind of took off with a friend, and we were doing all sorts of stuff. But what was interesting, like a lot of the viewers or listeners would understand, people like us, sometimes we would take refuge in the library, a bit nerdy. And one of the things that we had electives that we could do in year 7 and 8. I did all sorts of different bits and pieces and workshop and so on. But one of them you could do each year was do a library project. And this is quite interesting, really, because it's sort of pivotal for how my life turned out. So one year, I don't remember which, I did an electronics, and then the other year I did human physiology. So I put a lot of work into that. What was interesting, the human physiology, we had on the last day had to get up and present what we'd done. I got a really bad grade for my report, and I think the teacher thought I'd copied it all out, So I stood up and talked off the cuff about what I'd learned about red cells and hearts and things, and then she regraded an A in front of me. Nothing was said. So that was quite a moment in my life. So it's quite prophetic to what I ended up doing later on in life. So carrying on to ham radio, the first time I ever really saw amateur radio was when we moved. My father moved around a lot with the old sort of government departments, like I said, referred to Commonwealth countries in the UK. A lot of things were run by the government. It was all owned by them. And as a civil servant, the only way you could kind of work your way up the ladder was you had to move around a lot. And I think you've once referred to that. You had quite a few moves, didn't you? So another move, and there was a chap who worked with my father who was a ham. His name was Barry French. He's ZL2HF or 2HV. He's on a key now. And he had a TS520, I remember later thinking back what it was, which was a lovely looking, there was a 101 and there was a 520. 520s always looked a bit better. And I had to play with this. Anyway, he thought he'd help me and give me a copy of the radio amateurs exam, but I don't know how he did this, but he got it wrong. He got some professional exam, and I remember looking at this thing for years, and I'd pull it out of the drawer and have a look at it. Thought too hard. So, yeah, one heck of a way to put a kid off ham radio. So, so that was my first exposure. I had a lot of exposure to telephone switching through my father, which I found really interesting. I mean, it's a world that's gone now, isn't it? POTS, plain old telephone system.
Stroger switches.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say that. Yeah, like New Zealand had a lot of Stroger. We called it step by step or step, but yeah, Stroger switches. And we had the British Post Office 2000 type system. And not the nicest of system, but still fascinating about a walk through a place, and hear all the switches operating. We also, in the early 70s, my father was involved a lot in this. We were going to Crossbar, and we brought the Japanese stuff, which was based on the Bell 5 system I'd heard of, a Bell 5 switch, which was a American crossbar switch. I think it was probably a post-World War II Marshall Plan type help to the Japanese. I think they kind of just gave the rights to them. And of course, New Zealand had a lot of trade emerging with Japan in the 70s, so it was probably a reciprocal kind of thing.
In the 70s, we had the replacement of crossbar with number 5 ESS.
Yeah, you had the number 1 first, and that was funny you should say that, because near where we lived there was an unmanned central office that had a thing called a Plessey TXE2, so the British Post Office guys would know about that. That was a read relay system. The Bell 1 ESS was read relay too, but actually had the central control was actually 2 processors. It had a proper computer system running with a really weird memory system, but it was still a computer, whereas the British one was a bit simpler, more hardwired, but still electronic control of a read relay voice switch path. So we had that just down the road. So I got to see one of those when I was a kid, and that was quite interesting.
So that kind of took you down the path in terms of what you wanted to do?
Yes, it did. Yeah, it kind of did it in a bit. So it kind of led me into that, and radio's related. So when we had another move to a place called Whangarei, which is up the northern part of the country, north of Auckland, our largest city, quite nice and warm. They call it the Winterless North. Next door neighbour was Douglas, ZL1TW, who was an amazing guy. He was in his mid-30s then. He was an electrical engineer with the New Zealand Post Office, and my father worked for him. And my father had a lot of respect for him. And Douglas put his abilities down to being a ham, as being a good engineer, because he kind of knew the implications of what they were designing or what they're doing, what the technicians would have to do. He had a deep understanding. And Douglas, as soon as he moved in next door, he put up an 80-metre folded dipole. Not many people do that, with open wire folded dipole and fed with open wire feeders. And so I soon became a real pest for poor Douglas, because I was just asking him everything, So the local radio club, the Whangarei Amateur Radio Club, were running classes, and Douglas was one of the instructors, and so was another guy called Hugh Deverell. I can't remember his call. He's still around up there. Douglas is sadly a silent key now. And the exam was, I've heard a lot of people talk about this in the US as well. The exam was quite a bit tougher then. You had to draw circuits, and the theory part there was no multi-choice. It was all math questions and draw a diagram and so on. The regulations was multi-choice, but they'd throw in just at random, okay, what's the resonant frequency of a 20 picofarad capacitor and a 3 microhenry? So I had to learn how to do that, and my maths wasn't up to that. Handling exponents, I didn't have a scientific calculator. I could just do square roots. So poor Douglas had to teach me this in the evenings at his place. And okay, well, we gather together. You got to do so many microfarad and so many microhenry. So get the exponents together. Take the square root of the first number, but the other one you're going to have to just halve the exponent. If it's an odd number, you're going to have to convert it to an even and move the decimal place over, and then halve that, and then multiply by 2 pi, and then do the reciprocal. And he managed to get me doing it. Guess what? When I did the exam, there wasn't a single question about resonant frequency. But anyway, and in those days, I think like the US, it'd be 2 exams a year. We had one in March and one in October, and I passed in about March 1980. I'm pretty sure it was. And in those days, in New Zealand, we had a grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3 license. If you got the theory alone, you had a grade 3 and you're on VHF. If you passed 12 words a minute as well, you got a grade 2, which was 1 year on 80 and VHF. You had to do this purgatory for a year. And then at the end of that, if you did 12 words a minute again, you had to repeat it. You were grade 1 and you're free for all. But, I really struggled with the CW. I probably didn't really have a good mentor or anything to help me get going. And I learned it the wrong way by looking at dits and dars and things, dots and dashes, which plagues me to this day. I think there should be counselling available for people who find themselves in that situation. But I did it later. I'll come on to that. So, but the local radio club was very supportive. My first QSO was with a chap called John Ramsey at a 1kg. He's silent key, different call then.
You got a grade 3 license. Grade
3, yeah. So VHF and up. So you had one of those old crystal controlled sets. I think it's 7200, a TS, a Kenwood, or one of those ones you could pull the antenna out of the front as well. And
yes, I remember that. The Luggy Talkie.
Yeah, they were nice set.
I think Drake made a little.
They made something like that too, did they? Yeah. And that was on the old, New Zealand had an interesting repeater system then. We called them channel A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. They were, because we'd just developed independently. And it was a 700 kilohertz split here. It didn't matter those days. Everything was crystal control. So only about 3 years later, they changed to a 600 kilohertz split and then went to a frequency naming system. So to what we've got to this day. Yeah, so that was on the Channel E local repeater. And the club loaned me an ICOM 215. They were a sort of vertical thing. They were the FM version. There was a ICOM 202, which was an SSB.
Yeah, I remember it. I see it in my brain.
Yeah, quite a cool radio. And so I borrowed that, and then I got hold of what's called a Pi, PYE. Pi Cambridge. Pi was quite a big British company in TVs and radios and communication equipment. And the Cambridge, as in the university, the Cambridge was a radio for mobile use, and it was quite a big. So it wasn't small, and it was one of those ones that had a solid state receiver, but all germanium transistors. And the transmitter was tube-based valves, as we call it, and put out about 8 watts, and had an inverter in it for running off 12 volts. So that was my first radio I owned. But I couldn't quite get enough current to make the thing go properly on 12 volts. So I wonder I didn't kill myself, and I had some other old tube gear, and I just took the HV and direct into this thing, and it worked. As I say, I know you've asked a few others about this. Yes, when I was a kid, I did have a few mains electric shocks as well, but I survived. But the problem with in New Zealand, Australia, UK, it's 230 volts. It really knocks you a lot further, I'm sure, than 110.
Right, but the wires are smaller. Like here in Israel, you don't need the heavy wire gauges for the current.
Exactly, yeah. It does make it easier, too, for, you could easily have 2.4 kilowatts in a fan heater or something like that.
Yeah, on the same plug.
The same plug. Yeah, so you just have single-phase wiring in your house. One of the things I did back then, I had a copy of the old RSGB VHF handbook, and I thought, well, I wanted to have a more distant repeater, so I made a 2-element cubical quad on 2 meters with a diamond shape that you could feed at one corner or the other corner for vertical or horizontal. Something that people don't really do that often, but it worked perfectly well. And I think that's a good thing that young guys or young people like me or whatever, when you don't know the rules, you just look at something in your book and you try it, So that was the start of it. So the club was very supportive, and I got into the field day as well. The ZL field day is quite different from the ARRL type event because we're a fairly small country, about the size of California, and we're spread out north-south. There's no point in using 20 meters. You just every half you'll be in skip zone for half the place. So we just use 80 and 40, and no 2 meters, just keeping it simple. So we don't have that many clubs competing in it.
Why do they call it Jock White Field Day?
Yeah, that's a good question. In those days, it wasn't called Jock White. Jock White ZL2 Golf X-Ray. Jock, he was an amazing guy. He was a school teacher, and he was the first person in the world to get DXEC 300. So it was about 1960. He was a great DXer. And he looked after contesting for NZART, our national club, in New Zealand Association of Radio Transmitters. And so he looked after the column in our magazine and all that. And Jock was you didn't mess with Jock. He looked after all these things. And I never met him, unfortunately, but I know a lot of people who did. But he started in the 1950s, this field day, as a kind of a preparation for emergency MCOM work, but now it's a lot more social. There is competition in it, but it's probably more of a social event. So it runs on 80 and 40, and we run it over 2 days, and from early in the morning to late at night on the. We start about. There are restrictions on when you can set up. So on the Saturday, you can start putting antennas up at midday and start operating at 3 p.m. and then operate till midnight local. Then have a break overnight, start at 6 a.m. and run till 3 p.m. that day on the Sunday, and then tear down and have a debrief and tell some lies on what you're going to do next year, sort of thing. And but as I said, just 80 and 40, just to make the propagation easier. So I went along to one of these and coupled with a club and really enjoyed it. I was log keeping, I didn't operate. As an aside, in ZL1AF, a guy called Ian Ozier, he had a ICOM 701, brand new, and I've now brought a couple because I still think they're the best radio ever made. You have to put that on your show notes.
I hear this all the time. So professionally, you decided to go into the postal telephone office as a switch technician.
That's quite correct, yep.
With a burnishing tool.
Yeah, I've seen more relays than I've ever. Yeah. So what happened was my father got a promotion again, and here I was, 1 year of schooling left. I didn't really like school that much. I wasn't enjoying it. And I was doing kind of okay. And so I shifted. We moved down to Auckland, New Zealand's biggest city. And so I just walked into a job. I kind of did like the whole telephone switching thing. And my father thought it was a good idea. It was a job for life. It's a bit of a joke now, isn't it? As all these institutions have been carved up, sold up, and then melted for scrap and come back as Toyotas.
Right, and your telephone switch room doesn't have 30 employees anymore.
No. I came into it, yeah. I saw the writing on the wall a bit later. So I didn't think I could ever go to university. I didn't want to do another year of school in another place. It was not, I'm not sure. My parents were on a trajectory, and I think I was the last one left at home, and I think I got kind of forgotten about, so they dragged me down there. Anyway, when we moved to Auckland, I actually did apply in the New Zealand Post Office. They had a radio technician section and a separate telephone switching and carrier, transmission type area. So I applied for the radio, but I found out later that I was actually accepted, but they lost my application. That was a year or two later, and I'd already had another move. So I went to work in West Auckland at a central office, or we call them an exchange. There was a Strowger system, but they had out there attached a rural area going way up to West Auckland and up to the Tasman Sea, and so lots of small central offices that were unmanned, and it's a variety of different technologies. And I really enjoyed that. We had Strowger, step by step, and some of the Japanese crossbar, which I really liked. I think the crossbar was a lovely system. But they're also installing the first of the digital switches, which was NEC, Japanese equipment again, called the NEAX61 family, and they were a true digital switch, and that the speech at a line card was digitized from then on through the system. It was a digital switching. And so they were just starting to install some of that around the place. In fact, one of my highlights was we had a couple of small rural exchanges that used the old cord boards. They were manual switch, manual board, but they were the really old ones with local battery when you had your big Eveready cells on your by your phone. So you had a phone with a magneto crank, and the battery was supplied by your phone. You cranked a crank.
Right, the battery was for the talk voltage.
For the talk, yeah, for speech. So when you wanted to make a call the operator, you would crank the handle and a little line drop indicator, a little mechanical shutter would drop, and they'd see that, they'd put the cord in, and they'd talk to you and ask who you want to talk to. They'd plug into another one, and they would have a little key switch just to put ringing voltage down and connect you. And in fact, my mother actually did that post-World War II when she left school, and a lot of those old communities quite liked having their operators because they had call follow me, they had call forwarding.
Right. You could tell the operator where you were going to be, and I'll take all my calls over it.
If I could just tell a story, in New Zealand, bookmaking, gambling is a sort of a state-managed thing. And in those days, it was strictly controlled, and you weren't allowed to do it, privately. It was illegal. And on the west coast of the South Island where my mother lived, it was a bit of a Wild West kind of place. And the local bookie would ring them up. It's all illegal, of course. They'd say to the operator, okay, who's next? And they'd run a little list and tick it off. And every month or two, they'd get nylons and chocolates. But anyway, so I got to see the last of these cord boards cut over to the digital switch. So these people went from a crank telephone to a push-button DTMF phone, and late one night. I had a cut over.
What was amazing about all that stuff was they were like brilliant works of mechanical art.
Yeah, no, you're quite right.
There was no detail that was left undone.
Yeah.
Wiring harnesses were beautiful. The mechanics was amazing. And you wonder, they didn't have CAD systems. I mean, people were drawing all this stuff by hand. It
was all, when they installed a new big Strowger switch steps, all the cable runways and bundles were pre-worked out. There was an awful lot of cabling you had to do. In fact, I think I was a bit of an over enthusiastic pain in when I was quite young. I was only 16 when I started working. The boss soon gave me a job. He sent me off for a couple of months on my own to do a 50-line extension to a small Strowger switch by the coast by a place called Piha in West Auckland. And it was during the Falklands War in 82, so I can remember that running on the radio. So I got to do an extension to one of these things, and I think the boss was quite inspired. Okay, this guy's annoying a few people. He likes to do something. Let's give him a challenge and get him out of Dodge for a month or two. So yeah, so that was when I got into amateur radio a bit more in the Auckland area, and they had the Auckland VHF group was one of the clubs there, more interested in VHF, and there was a guy called Vaughan, ZL2TW, and Don, ZL1BJB, with a president and the secretary. And they were very supportive and got me in, and in fact got me on the committee. I thought I was too young. I was only like 17 or 18 or something. But I think they were just, they could see I obviously had some potential. And so that was pretty cool. I mucked around with them for a year or two while I was there.
Weren't you also a member of the Wellington VHF group?
Yeah, I am a member, but I'm not active there. I'm across the Cook Strait from there. Blenheim, where I live, is only about 70 kilometres from there, but there's a big body of water between us. But I suddenly had pay packets, so I brought an ICOM 2A, which was $300 back then. Goodness me. You'd still get, NZ 400 will get you an ICT 90, or, the latest ICOM small handheld. I got a TR 9130 as well and got active on 2 meter SSB and a bit of portable work. But, so the post office, I did 2 years in Auckland. I started on a whole lot of in-house instruction. I worked it out before. My 5 years with them, I spent 59 weeks in the classroom. And some of it was with Polytechnic, sort of outside tuition for technician certificate. And some of it was in-house stuff that the system ran. But I got to see a lot of different technologies up there. Like they took us for a bit of a tour around the place as trainees, and we went to a cable terminal on the north shore of Auckland where compact cable came in from Suva and then out to Australia, and then another cable, Tasman 1, came in from Sydney, and ANSCAN, which was a newer one, which went across the Pacific. And these are all frequency division multiplex, submarine cables.
So these are submarine cables.
Yeah, with repeaters along the way and power feeding from each end, plus 2,000 one end, minus 1,000, whatever the other, and very strict current limiting and voltage controls, and it blow up all the daisy-chained electronics in the repeaters, yeah.
But what happened that caused you to do a career change? You made a very dramatic career change.
What happened then was we had one more shift. My father got the top job in Christchurch, which is the largest city on the South Island, New Zealand. That was one that was hit with quite a nasty earthquake in 2011. And how old was I? About 18. I wasn't really quite ready to leave home, and I wasn't sure what to do. And a job came up in Christchurch, so I just transferred down. As it turned out, my life wouldn't have turned out quite the way it did if I hadn't gone. So I went down to Christchurch, did one more year in central offices and some digital point-to-point links because the internet wasn't around in those days. And then I got an interview at the radio section there, and I transferred over and retrained for 2 years to get a radio technician certificate. One quite reasonably well known, Andrew Barron, ZL2TW, Delta Whiskey. He writes a lot of books on Amazon, manuals. Well, yeah.
Right, he was a guest on the QSO Today podcast.
Yeah, and another guy, Rod McIntosh, ZL3NW, who's got DXCC on 6 meters EME. They were all working there, and quite a few other really bright sparks. And so I quite enjoyed that. I was only there for 2 years, but it was a great period of change again. Last vacuum tube gear going, digital microwave coming in, analog microwave going out, and so on. But all replaced by fiber now, of course. So what happened, though, was about the career change. My older brother was rowing competitively, in 8s and 4s at a local club. He was down there as well. He just got out of the army. And so I started doing that and met a girl who I'm not married to. She fell by the way somewhere. And she could sort of see some potential in me and said, you should be going to university or something. And I could see the New Zealand Post Office was quite overstaffed, and we were heading for quite a lot of reform in the 80s, like the UK had it, a big clean out of government departments and privatisation. And I could see the writing on the wall. And I looked at doing electrical engineering, but my maths wasn't strong enough. But remember back to my school when I did the project on human physiology, and I sort of had an interest, but I thought, no, I'm not clever enough to do that. So I signed up. And we went back down south to Dunedin, which is the southernmost large city in New Zealand, and they've the university there is Otago, O-T-A-G-O, Otago. It's an anglicisation of a Maori word, and I signed up for a medical intermediate year, which is like a first in New Zealand. Most entrants into medical school are straight in school 1 year and then in. We don't have the sort of graduate system like in the US. UK is similar, and so is Australia. And so I signed up for this 1 year first year course for general sciences, and very nearly got put off. Actually, it was quite interesting. I I was queuing up to meet the course advisor, and they looked and could see I hadn't done that last year at school, and I was told I was a special case and had to wait into another queue. And the dean of the med school came down to see all us rejects and tried to talk us out of it and said, you'll be up against a lot of bright young things. He didn't know I was one. Well, I didn't really know I was one either. I was about 21 then. As an aside, in my 5th year at med school, I was in the Medical Students Association, sort of a social position, and got to meet this guy again at the committee change, the dean. He was still there. And I said, do you remember me? And you tried to talk me out of this. He was kind of a little bit, I don't really remember that. But so anyway, I got into the class of 175 second year, which was the first year of medicine. So another 2 years of preclinical, going through all the preclinical sciences and then pathology and so on. And then 3 more years after that, the clinical years on the wards and so on, which is it's a bit of a boot camp, actually, a baptism of fire. If you can survive a ward round with a professor in a bad mood who's firing questions at you, you kind of, you can sort of face anything, really. It's not quite Full Metal Jacket, but it's just about getting there sometime. Something you'll be interested in, though, while I was at university, at medical school, studying, in the summer holiday vacation, you go out and get work, and I had 3 years over 3 summer holidays working at Tate Electronics in Christchurch, who make the
radios.
Radio gear, two-way mobile gear, and also, the repeaters and so on. And no, I didn't really enjoy that. It wasn't a technical job, even though I had a qualification. It was factory maintenance work, which was a lot of fun. And they were making T500s and T700s, the land mobile sets, and then the T800, then became the T8000, where they were the base stations in production.
I have a bunch of the Tate radios. They're my repeaters and base stations and stuff here.
That's pretty cool. The T2000, which you might be from the base station, the mobile. Well, I got to see one when it was a MDF, fiberboard. There was a guy, an engineer. I was doing some maintenance work in a workshop on the engineering R&D side, and this guy was machining this up to paint it next to take to a board meeting or for Mr. Tate to approve, Sir Angus. And I said, "What's that?" And he goes, "Well, I can't tell you, but it's in your radio." So I got to see the T2000.
They're brilliant radios for making repeaters.
Oh, they are. They're bulletproof.
A lot of isolation.
Yeah, they're pretty well engineered, especially after T500 was all plastic. They learnt their lesson. So I worked there, and I met Sir Angus Tate a couple of times. In fact, on my last day when I walked out and I was off to last year at med school, I went past his office and knocked on the door. "Hello." I stuck my head in, and he didn't know who the heck I was. And I just told him who I was and what I'd been doing, and thanked him very much for all the holiday work. And wished me well, and off I went. He died just a few years later, but he was a very nice chap. So I graduated, and it was quite funny, actually. My parents were very proud, but my father, who had tutted a bit when I was resigning to go to university, did say, "Well, look, you are leaving a job for life." It's all gone. If you ever hear John Cleese from Monty Python, telling his story, his father was most upset that he was going off to Oxford, and he thought he should get a nice, safe job in a bank. But it always reminds me of that. But anyway, so I graduated from medical school, and I worked in a town not far from here, Nelson, or here, Blenheim, here as an intern. I've come back again. And that's where I sort of started to get back into things again. I met my wife, Claire. She was a midwife. I was doing an OB-GYN rotation, and we ended up getting married, and I built the odd kit set. I thought I'd better get back into this. And you know something? She said, "Oh, I like that smell. What is it?" And I said, "It's solder." She said, "Oh, it smells good." I knew I was onto a good thing,
So you were able to do a ham radio and medical school at the same time?
No, actually, going back, when I became a radio technician trainee, I kind of lost interest. Some people that happens with, when you're doing it during the day. There are some people who are very keen during the day. Yeah, and it didn't really work.
Yes, I know this.
Plus, I was a bit younger there, and I was just, getting into having, parties and rowing. And although during the rowing season we behaved, we didn't drink too much, but during winter it was game on. And so I dropped out of ham radio, and it wasn't until I moved back here, where I am now, to Blenheim, back in 1997. What happened then was I got a promotion in the mail from NZART to rejoin. They did a mail out to all a cut price. I thought, I sent my visa number off and rejoined. And of course, what then happened is that put me on the radar for the local radio club. And then Helen, she's now ZL1HH, was the secretary. She got in touch with me and invited me along to a club meeting. And kind of the rest is history for ham radio. Grant ZL1BK, who is a real rock for our club, he had a Yaesu FT100, the Yaesu mobile set. You could take the front panel off it. And it did 1.8 to 432. And I was amazed because when I'd left ham radio way back in the 80s, there was no such thing as that. And I thought, this is pretty cool. So there've been a lot of changes over that time. Packet radio, it kind of had a peak and was falling off again, except it went off into APRS. Our exam system had completely changed. We had a volunteer examiner system and a software package that the late Gary Bowles at ZL1AN had worked out. He was a physics professor in Auckland who, before his time really in the 90s, developed a randomization software that was unhackable for people to just run, and produce an exam. If you failed, you just do another one and you print one off for you. And I did the CW exam. I got stuck in, got myself a TS130S second hand and did the CW, passed. And then only for about a year or two later to have it abolished, but that's okay. And I put up a horizontal loop and fed it with open wire feeders and did a lot of working around the world there. I really enjoyed that. And I operated on holiday. But then going back to Jock White, you said about the Jock White Field Day, I got involved in resurrecting it locally. And to cut a long story short, I ended up being the national manager for that. So I now process the entries for that and quite enjoy that. It's a bit of a challenge.
The National Club, the New Zealand Association of Radio Transmitters, is kind of like the ARRL for New Zealand, right?
Yes, correct. Like WIA or RSGB. Yep, exactly right.
It's a non-profit organization.
Right, it's correct. In fact, we're charitable, so we have a charitable system here where if you're for education or philanthropic reasons, we can get charitable status, which means if you invest money and interest, pay tax on it or in any donation, so tax deductible. So anyway, look at this here. So we're not for profit. And so what happened, I guess you want to know how I got involved in that at a higher level. So I got really enjoyed the local club. They were really a lot of fun, really enjoyed things, got involved with repeater maintenance, helping out with emergency communications and car rallies and goodness knows what, and International Lighthouse Weekend. That was a lot of fun. And then Break-In, which is our national magazine, like QST, except a lot less advertising. When I was president, I used to look at QST and just see how much income they must get. Of course, a lot less now, sadly, that...
MFJ has taken 3 pages out of the paper?
MFJ, yeah. So that's unfortunate. But anyway, NZRT would have a monthly council meeting. Their national committee was called council. They had 9 people on it. They had a president and a vice president from the council. And they would have their meeting on the air, which had been a long-standing thing from way back when, telephone calls were expensive. It was starting to become a bit unsustainable with noise, but they needed an on-air secretary. So I put my hand up and just once a month you'd listen and take minutes and email it off to the president. And then there was a few vacancies coming up. There was an election coming up in 2005, and myself and 2 others, Mark, ZL2UFI, and Jim Meechan, ZL2BHF, who does a lot of work for Newsline, the international Newsline, and our official broadcast. We were all sort of thinking, we had something to contribute. There was just 1 or 2 minor contentious issues at the time where we thought, let's all go on at the block, So we did. We came on to the National Council, and we had a change. We had a new president there, Bruce, ZL2WP. And so every 2 years we have an election, and I became the vice president in 2007. But just one thing that was interesting that happened then was, the foundation license concept, which the RSGB have, and they have it in Australia too. They sort of picked it up pretty much from RSGB. So I was sent over to a WIA, Wireless Institute of Australia conference in about 2005, I think it was. And their president, Michael Owen, VK3KI, and their silent key, and their secretary, Chris Jones, VK2ZDD, I think he's silent key as well. They were very evangelical about the foundation license which they'd set up, and I was almost sat down at their feet and told all about it. And we sort of, their foundation license, so it's a 10-watt limit. You have an F prefix in your call sign. I don't think you can't. You have to use commercial gear. You could probably use a T2000 someone's program for you, for instance, but you couldn't build stuff. You had limited HF privileges and VHF and so on.
So this is like a novice license in America?
Yeah, novice license. We actually had a novice here that ran for quite a few years but got scrapped, had very little uptake. But the foundation license, yeah, it's like a novice license in the UK and in Australia is very popular. We brought the idea back, we kicked the idea around here and kicked the can down the road, so to speak, but it never really got traction. The members were a bit hot and cold. But I'll come on to that later, my next time round, because I had a break from NZART Council. What happened, there was a few things I did. I helped, I'd been running radio, I'd run some radio classes locally, so I did some DVDs recording that, and we could then release it to people to help learn from home, nationally. And
was the purpose of the foundation license to encourage people towards amateur radio to come into the hobby by kind of dumbing it down, perhaps, so it's not as big an obstacle for people to actually make that transition to amateur radio? And the current licensees, I have a sense of why they would have an objection to it, but why would they have an objection to the foundation license in New Zealand if it seemed to be popular in the other Commonwealth countries?
You're quite correct, I think. And the idea was to get people in and then upgrade them, like the novice license used to do. And that was the whole idea, get them in and get them. And they had a very good training manual, the WIA. It was a lovely book. And the WA were very enthusiastic. They did offer us, look, if NZART takes the system up, we could share printing and you could have a 4 pages, in there of your, you know what I mean, have a common book. But our system by this stage only had one exam, an NCW. And it was sort of felt that the system we had was working pretty well. And I think to a certain extent that's right. But what we did was we did actually come up with a new strategy. So I'll just come on to that actually. I had a break from NZART in 2009. I had teenagers at home, and they were causing a bit of work, like they do sometimes. So decided it was time to step aside. But then things settled down, and then we had a vacancy back on the National Council in 2011. Someone had resigned, and they sort of approached me, would like to come back on. So yeah, okay. Then became the vice president at the next election in 2013. And what happened was, and then I finally became president. I was obvious this time I wasn't going to escape becoming president. So in 2015, when Vaughan ZL1VH changed its call, he was one of the ones that got me on a committee years ago in Auckland when he stepped down and I took over. And then after the annual general meeting that year, the new council, we sat around and said, look, what are we going to do about this? Because people have been raising the foundation license again.
For years now.
Yeah, it'd been ticking along for a while. What had happened in the meantime is two very keen amateurs, Lee Jennings, ZL2AL, who's a silent key, but was a very prolific DXer in New Zealand. Another chap, Warren Harris, ZL2AJ, lived in the same area. And they started a thing called Ham Cram as a weekend course to pass the exam. And I must admit, when I looked at it, I was a little skeptical because I thought, you're not really getting a deeper understanding. When I taught how to pass the exam, for instance, with transistors, you'd have to go into holes and things and, how this works in depletion region. You'd have to teach that idea of teaching a little above the exam to give a deeper understanding. But what these guys did say, well, look, let's just teach them the material to pass the exam, get them on board, and then develop them further. And we kicked this idea around and we thought that, look, this has to be the way to go. We've got a one exam system. Morse had gone by this stage. One written exam, bang, you're in with 4 privileges. There is a 3-month stand down and do a certain number of contacts, but that's just a minor detail. Essentially, you're away.
You do those contacts with an Elmer?
No, you can do them on your own. It's just, That's what we decided to do, is let's, as an association, drop this foundation license idea. Now, this is no slight on the WIA or the RSGB. It was just our system was a bit different and lend itself to that. So that's what we did. And our national magazine, we put out a special edition of that with concentrating on recruitment and courses and things. And the material that Warren and Lee had built up and had been picked up in the meantime by 1 or 2 other clubs we centralised that in our headquarters so people could just email Debbie, our National Secretary, and get hold of it and then run a ham cram. And Warren Harris was very good at going around and helping other clubs getting going. And it's actually been quite successful. We're getting lots of people through.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO. I hear about these ham cram exams, but what does your retention look like? I mean, a lot of people pass the test. What percentage of them actually get on the air? What kind of follow-up does your club offer in order to make sure that people don't take the test and then disappear?
I don't have the stats on that. By the time I had left, but I think anecdotally it seems to be working. It could be because our national membership levels was a bit of a slowly falling. That seems to have turned around, like a lot of national associations. And I think clubs are being rejuvenated, having more people on board. So it seems to have been successful, anecdotally. And it kept things simple. We didn't have to go to we didn't have to go to our national regulator and ask for, which we have good relations with, and ask for another exam, another sort of, another class of license. And so I think it's been pretty successful, and it's continuing to this day. And I don't claim no credit for this at all. All we did was thought, why have a dog and bark yourself? Reinvent the wheel. We had a good system, and we picked it up and ran with it.
I actually interviewed a young man in episode 503 who had an interest in ballooning from being on YouTube. He discovered weather balloons and meteorology, and his gateway into amateur radio was pico ballooning and discovering that he could have better payloads, worldwide payloads, if he had an amateur radio license. Are you seeing that the youth of today in New Zealand have similar kinds of needs, meaning that the idea of operating CW or single sideband or FM on a repeater is not as appealing as perhaps supplying some kind of technology supplement using amateur radio to the projects they already have?
Yes, the pico ballooning, I haven't seen that one, but we're seeing it. I think we're seeing it at all parts of the spectrum. We're getting new people coming through, not necessarily younger either. And I'll come on to that with one of your questions later, but is that we're seeing them getting involved in the more traditional stuff. Some are involved in activating old military equipment and stuff and seem to be enjoying that. So, and at our last National Field Day, the ZL2TW, youngsters on the air, they had a club station and got going. So they're still enjoying the more traditional stuff, but certainly are coming in with doing other things in digital modes and so on as well. Haven't seen the pico ballooning though. I did listen to that podcast and found it fascinating. That's a good point.
Well, the other thing I noticed, and it seemed like it was unique to New Zealand, this is from a podcast interview I had maybe, 6 years ago, that double sideband operation on 80 meters seems to be popular, especially amongst people who are doing maybe soda or hiking along the national trail. Do you know anything about that?
I know who you mean. You talk about Eric, ZL2BMI, who lives not that far from me. I think there's been a bit of resurgence and then sort of dropped down again. I think maybe as people are finding some of these newer, cheaper, small, portable sets that are so prolific these days. You only have to listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast and you get to hear about just how many there are around. There still is that people are still doing home brewing and so on. ZL2BNE, who lives not far from me, he actually got Bill Merrer's friend, Pete Giuliano, to join our local club to have to do a Zoom meeting to go over home brewing and stuff. And sadly, I was working; I couldn't go to it. One of the things that working in an emergency department, you do shift work, it can be a bit unsociable.
You're not in the leadership position anymore, but when you were there, and even now, is there a competition for the frequencies that amateur radio operators have in New Zealand by outside interests, like large telephone companies and things like this? And is that affecting amateur radio operators in New Zealand?
Not in a big way, no. It's funny you should say that. When I was involved, after I left NZRT, I was helping out a bit with liaising with the government over regulatory matters, and we put a submission in. They had a review of the 3 gigahertz band, which I know the ARRL look like they're going to lose at one stage too. I don't know what's happened there. I've lost track of that.
No, I think they did lose a piece of it.
Yeah, we've lost. I'm not sure. I can't remember the fine details. There's been an announcement recently, but we're still allowed chunks of it. And I mean, it was a huge band. So if you get dropped down to even a fraction of it, there's still plenty of room for narrow band modes and so on, which is what most people are going to do. I think is probably, there's CW, SSB, CWFM, and so on. But that's been the biggest threat we've had for some time. There was that concern with 1296 around, some of the satellite downlinks, for is it not the European navigation system? There's GLONASS and there's GPS and there's one of the...
Right, ADS-B?
Yeah, one of the European systems, but that's a worldwide problem, not just us. But 3 gigahertz has been the biggest one recently. We haven't had anything else for a while. The last big one we had was 1296 with airport radar, where we're a secondary user, but we dodged that one. That was about 30 years ago.
In New Zealand, do you have a linked repeater network? I mean, can somebody operate VHF from one end of New Zealand to the other end and stay in the system?
Yeah, our emergency communication guys have got a network DMR system. And we do have an analog system called the national system that runs one end to the other, which is FM on 70 centimetres. So that just keys up down the whole length of the country, and it's got spurs running off. They've had a fire on a hill south of here, which has put part of it off, but they're working on that. So we've got that one. Nothing quite like the Cactus network in the southwest. Yeah, although our country doesn't go very far east.
That's the intertie, right?
Yeah, our country is long north-south, but pretty narrow east-west. If you look at it on the map.
So the reason I'm asking some of these questions, Stuart, is because I kind of compare it to Israel. I mean, obviously New Zealand's much larger than Israel, but we have a network that nobody uses. I'm wondering, are your hams active on the national network, for example? Are they active and it justifies all of the infrastructure that's dedicated to these conversations?
Yeah, that's a good question. Probably not so much. And I think one of the things when our association was growing an awful lot in the sort of 70s and 80s, and new clubs would form and new repeaters would go up. And I do think we're probably a bit over-repeated in that if you've got overlapping coverage and you've got, as clubs have gotten a bit smaller, there's more work to maintain these things and less activity, you start to wonder if maybe consolidating things down a bit. And in fact, we've seen that with some clubs that have sort of merged a bit or combining resources. And but there is quite a bit of use of 40 metres during the day too, which is quite good for covering around the country, and 80 at night. So there's a lot of activity on those two bands, give good coverage around the whole country. You can pretty much easily have a net on 80 or 40, depending on the time of day, that will cover the whole country. And you're not going to get into a skip zone like you would in a larger place.
You'll use an NVIS antenna?
Yeah, that's correct. In fact, I was going to make a comment about that. I'm a bit lucky because I'm married again, because in 2016, my wife Claire died suddenly, and I had a break from being president, and Phil, ZL3PAH, our vice president, took over, and he's a great friend, and ran the outfit. Well, I sort of figured, what the heck am I going to do now, like you do when something like that happens? And the support of Debbie, ZL2TW, our national secretary and business manager, Debbie Morgan, who's been in that role for nearly 28 years. She was a great stalwart for the association and helped keep things running. And so anyway, I carried it back on as president and stepped down in 2019. But I remarried in 2020, and Jodie, my new wife, is a nurse. She calls soldering, we call it solder, not soldering. She calls soldering smolder. She calls it smoldering. Are you going to do some smoldering? But she's very supportive. And on our lawn, I've got a 40-foot antenna with a fan dipole on the thing. So I'm allowed to have that. So that's pretty cool. So I've struck it lucky.
Yeah, what's the current rig then?
An IC 7300, like half of the world. I've got some gear I'm wanting to restore, though. I've got two ICOM 701s. I mentioned them before. I've got an SP104, the Heath kit with the digital display, and I've got an S Collins S line, a few other bits, FTDX 401 that works, and so a few bits and pieces. I like collecting old stuff, but you know what it's like. You collect more than you can restore. So one day, have to move this stuff one.
Do you have a ham radio workbench?
Yeah, I've got one right through the next room, but it's not so suitable for filming. But yeah, I've got plenty of room. I've got a dedicated room in a new house we built, so I'm very lucky with benches in there.
And what's the best piece of test equipment you have on your ham radio workbench?
Probably I've got an HP SIGGEN. I can't remember the model number, and I've just picked up a Marconi SIGGEN as well. And that's handy to have. And I've got an HP Spectrum Analyzer. It was one that's built for CDMA.
Oh, yeah, I think I have one.
They're huge.
Right, but it's a signal generator, deviation scope, all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And it's humongous, though. You have to really provide... It's quite heavy. You need a hand to move the thing. So I've accumulated a few bits of gear, and the picture I provided you for the page is you can see a frequency counter which was made by a ham radio club in New Zealand in the 70s as a kit set, and it's got Nixie tubes, and it still goes. So I really love that's pride of place. I love Nixies. And
so even though you're a physician, it sounds to me like the transition from electronics to emergency room physician was done so early that you have all of this basic hands-on knowledge, but then you have this other hands-on knowledge. As a physician, are you involved in ARES or something like that, emergency services that kind of blend amateur radio with helping people in a physical emergency?
No, we don't tend to do that so much here in New Zealand, in that if someone's needed on the spot, there'll be a rescue helicopter be called in with a team on board who may or may not have a physician on there. So I don't do that. I have helped out at the local radio club with ARES type work with search and rescue and events and so on, but not so much now. I'm just finding with a young family again, I've acquired a 12 and nearly 14-year-old, back to teenagers.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So I don't have so much time for that. So, but you're saying about the technical background I've got is quite useful when you're troubleshooting people. I don't treat it as cold as that. I really enjoy my interactions with patients. But when you're trying to work out what the heck's going on with someone, because emergency medicine is not all, limbs missing and so on. An awful lot of it is people with not immediate life-threatening problems, but people who are quite unwell. And you've got the limited amount of time. You've got to try and work out what are you going to do with this person. Are they okay to go home? You need admit into hospital. What area are you going to go to? What treatment are you going to start? And having a technical approach to life can be quite good for troubleshooting and in your mind working out where do things cross over, because humans are a bit fuzzy logic and have intermittent faults, and but you can't hit them like the TV set. Well, that we do defibrillate.
Your wife would probably be the one to remind you. Mine always reminds me that I look at every problem like a technician. You start with a power cord and work your way up. We'll have a poll. We'll see if people put comments in the show notes page.
Well, could I just make a comment about that? When people are really seriously ill, but you're trying to do troubleshooting, and one expression that you sometimes use, well, the air's going in and out and the blood's going around and around. You're trying to, okay, they've got a blood pressure, they've got oxygenation, what else is wrong? You know what I mean?
Right, you have your checklist.
Yeah, you're working at the big bus at the top, what's working and what isn't, what on the spacecraft's good, sort of thing.
Well, it's annoying to people that don't think this way. I've learned. What is your favorite operating mode?
A field day, I really enjoy CW. That's only once a year.
Considering it was such a challenge at the beginning.
I know. I do enjoy it. It's quite a bit of fun. And I think anyone who's ever been there in a tent and there's some people listening and you're operating and someone gives you frequency or mucks you around, and there's always a few exclamations, and you've got a can of beer in this hand and I'm using a hand key, and it can be quite hilarious. Only the nerds would understand that, I think. But I do like SSB, a phone on HF, and I do operate that and a bit of 2 meters locally. But the 7300, which is amazing. I mean, there are newer stuff around now, but isn't it amazing what you can get in a relatively cheap box? Tricks.
I've never had a better radio than the IC7300, and I have a TS520 next to it. The 50-year, 40-year comparison is quite remarkable.
You're not wrong, yeah.
What is exciting you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
I think really the internet and everything that spins out of it. I was just thinking, if you've got a 2N3904 and you want to know the pin out, you can't remember. You just get the data sheet and download it. You used to have to have a bookshelf full of data books or manuals or circuits, or, you want to look up, your Heathcote SP104 and you can find the user group and people who have fixed them and so on. So all that information in all its forms that falls out of the internet. And along with that, AliExpress and so on, and you can go online and buy bits and pieces. Obviously, there are some counterfeit parts and so on, but I think components are easier to get probably than they have been for a long time. And I think we went through a bit of a dry patch for a while, and now with the proliferation of the internet and availability of parts and so on, the availability of equipment at a relatively cheap cost that we were just talking about before. So these are all the good things. I think digital modes, I don't use them myself, but I know they've been a savior for people in high noise environments. So there's a lot of really cool things going on. And then all the other things that we hear about on the podcast, of people going out, SOTA, POTA, and portable operation and better gear for doing that with. There's really so much to do, isn't there? And so many things to help make it easier for you.
Do you have advice that you'd give to newer returning hams to the hobby now that you've been in it a while, you've been in leadership positions, you've seen it from up high and down on the ground?
I think like a lot of your viewers, a lot of the people you interview, get involved with the radio club if you can. They're normally not too far away from them. And find like-minded people, get active and read, get online, have a look at all the material around and find out something that you're really interested in and pursue that. And if you don't like it, we'll change to something else. But and I think too, if you're young and new, don't feel like, someone might say, oh, no, I've tried, that doesn't work. Like I said, when I was quite young and made a 2-element cubicle quad, no one would ever do that. But if someone was new and said, look, give it a go, it actually does work. There are some of these old ideas and things. So, yeah, don't let people hold you back, have a go. And that would be my advice.
Yeah, fail fast, but fail many times.
Exactly, yeah.
It's a great way to learn.
Yeah.
Stuart, you've been a wonderful guest. I thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. With that, I want to wish you 73, and thank you for coming on.
Oh, thank you, Eric. I've really enjoyed it. I get on my bike every day to try and keep fit, and I listen to podcasts and I listen to yours, and I've really enjoyed listening to them, and it's been a real privilege to come on. I think of all the great people you've interviewed before me, and really, really happy to be part of it. And keep up the good work, Eric. Shalom.
Thanks, Stuart. That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Stuart. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in ZL2TW in the search box at the top of the page. You can sponsor the transcription of this episode or any of the previous episodes by clicking on the transcription button on every show notes page. The cost is $75 per episode, regardless of the length. We will quickly transcribe the episode and give you credit for your sponsorship. Please send us the call sign of the podcast to make sure that we transcribe what you want. Remember that QSO Today is value for value. Please support our project by making a donation or becoming a listener sponsor today. Use our Amazon link before shopping at Amazon, as we receive a small commission on your Amazon purchases. Subscribe to our mailing lists, both my blog and the podcast, and forward the messages to friends and family who would enjoy QSO Today content. Promote us on social media and give us a 5-star rating and reviews whenever you are asked. QSO Today is available on every podcast player and venue, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and Podcasting 2.0. Get a Podcasting 2.0 player to make it easy to get your next episode as soon as we publish. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who, as the consummate artist, makes this host and his guests always sound brilliant. Ben also publishes a weekly Jewish history podcast. There is a link to that on the QSO Today homepage. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.